I think we all know how the story ends. All of America's top federal authorities find no evidence of collusion or conspiracy. There was no client list, no blackmail, nothing left behind at all. The banker who spent his career building a mysterious fortune while he managed money for billionaire clients that probably didn't exist, while also trafficking girls to and from a private island in the Caribbean at the same time as he hosted some of the world's foremost politicians, businessmen, intellectuals, and celebrities as house guests, he had acted completely alone. It was all an unfortunate coincidence and nothing more. The story of Jeffrey Epstein faded into the past as the world kept turning.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?
Or at least that's what the story would have been if there weren't already mountains and mountains of evidence of Epstein being not just a psychopath, but also at the center of a crime ring that involved the world's most powerful people, procuring victims for them to abuse together. Even now, with the federal government conflicting themselves and going back on their word in regards to his case, the controversy and mystery around Jeffrey Epstein has reached a fever pitch. Silence doesn't make it go away. It's only made the questions grow louder as people's trust in our leadership is turning to dust. But in order to understand how Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to happen, what made him the monster he was, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, before the island, before the fortunes, before the world knew his name, and we have to take a much closer look at his life and the system that enabled him. Jeffrey Epstein first appears in any public capacity in July of 1980 when he's 27 years old, but the context is very strange. There's an article I found from Cosmopolitan magazine where he was listed as Bachelor of the Month with a tiny blurb and a black and white photo next to it. It says, financial strategist Jeffrey Epstein talks only to people who make over $1 million a year. If you're a cute Texas girl, write this New York dynamo at 55 Water Street, 49th floor, New York, blah, blah, blah. Because for the first 20 years of his career, Epstein garnered only occasional and brief mentions in the press. He had no real public recognition at all in the way that most high-level bankers might. And that's because there wasn't really a sensible explanation as to how he got there in the first place. Jeffrey Edward Epstein, born in Brooklyn in 1953, was the son of two working-class Jewish parents who, by all accounts, were completely normal. His mother, Pauline, worked a full-time job as a teacher's assistant while raising the kids, and his father worked for the City of New York's Parks Department as a gardener. Former friends and neighbors would use words like simple, humble, and gentle when talking about Epstein's parents, his brothers, and even Jeffrey himself. One former neighbor would later write that he was a nerdy little boy. People said that he was smart, overweight, always smiling, but mostly quiet. In high school, Epstein liked algebra and calculus, and he was on the math team, but his teammates would later describe him as not sticking out all that much. But he was smart enough to graduate high school in 1969, 2 years early, and he would then attend Cooper Union College, a very small school in Manhattan known for offering completely free tuition. He studied math there, although after 2 years he transferred to NYU, but he ended up leaving there after 3 years without any college degree at all. But within 2 months, Epstein had picked up a full-time job anyway. He had become a high school math teacher, not just at any school, but at one of the most prestigious in Manhattan, a school for the children of the elites. The students were the children of highly paid bankers, developers, politicians, people that could afford to pay a tuition equal to $50,000 a year today. By the time he started teaching at Dalton, Epstein was almost a completely different person. Basically, as a teacher, Jeffrey Epstein was a sleazy scumbag and a bit of a disaster. In the mid-1970s, students at one of New York's most esteemed prep schools were surprised to encounter a new teacher who pushed the limits of the school's strict dress code, wandering the halls in a fur coat, gold chains, and an open shirt that exposed his chest. But it wasn't just a willingness to dress provocatively, it was how he interacted with students that left an impression on many of them for decades after. He was apparently popular among female students, as many young teachers might be, but the problem was that he not only embraced the attention, but also seemed to have chased after it. The story goes that at one point, he even started showing up at students' parties, including ones where they would have been drinking underage. But before this private school teacher in his mid-20s could ever get involved in something that might implicate him in a serious way, Epstein was fired from the Dalton School for performance issues. He simply wasn't a good teacher. But at the same time though, he was able to move his career in a way that I could only describe as failing upwards. Because if you fast forward about 20 years, Epstein was no longer this sort of aimless college dropout who had a reputation for being a bit of a creep towards students at the school he worked at. It was almost as if Epstein would go on to become a completely, literally different person. When you look deeper at how exactly Epstein goes from this disgraced school teacher to flying a jetliner around the world while he rubs elbows with the rich and famous, the puzzle pieces don't really fit together. It would only be a few months after getting fired from the Dalton School in 1976 until Epstein found another job. Specifically, he got hired at the giant investment firm Bear Stearns as an assistant to a floor trader. And it's the second time he did that in just a couple of years. Because if he did do one thing right while working at Dalton, it was impress his students' rich and powerful parents.
Specifically, he was hired off the recommendation of a student's parent he had impressed who also happened to be friends with Alan Greenberg, CEO of the bajillion-dollar Bear Stearns investment bank. Greenberg was also known for coming from a working-class background, and he liked to hire people with what he called PSD degrees: poor, smart, and desperate to be rich. Whether or not getting his foot in the door was his original goal while working at a private school, whatever it was, Epstein had launched himself up the ladder in a massive way.
And it's kind of weird, but Epstein's time at this giant financial services firm, it wasn't all that different from his time as a teacher. Within just 4 years there, he gets promoted from junior assistant to limited partner, which is a pretty crazy trajectory for someone with no college degree. But then, just a year after that, he was actually asked to quit or be fired during an SEC investigation into insider trading at Bear Stearns. But for the rest of the 1980s, he would start or get involved in a strange series of businesses that, if we didn't know they existed, kind of sound made up.
Speaking of strange businesses, I wanted to let everyone know that the shirt I'm wearing in this video, I designed it and embroidered it myself, and it's on sale now. I think it's pretty obvious what the meaning is here, that our entire world is being sold out to evil people. So if you want to buy the most morbid and grim YouTube merch ever made, it is available. It's actually really high quality. The shirts are super solid, they're made with American cotton, and the embroidery is done on location at my studio, and there's free shipping inside the US. So you can check out spiritworld.store, help support the channel in a really big way, and cop a super nice shirt at the same time. That's spiritworld.store to buy the American Realty shirt, or the link is also below in the description.
Probably the strangest out of everything he did during this time was Towers Financial Corporation, a collection agency that was in the business of buying consumer medical debt. While he was hired as a consultant and paid the equivalent of $69,000 a month today, the first job he was given was to start using the company as a raiding vessel for corporate takeovers. In the 80s, there was this popular practice of buying a large stake in a corporation, then firing top executives, and then downsizing even further to increase the share value before selling. Basically, you'd take over and ruin a company just to make money from it. And their first move was to attempt a takeover of a kind of old, declining airline, Pan American World Airways, in 1987. A year later, they also tried to take over Emory Air Freight. And while both attempts failed, that wasn't the problem. The problem is that they were using money they didn't actually have. Basically, while this company was claiming to be a debt collection agency, they had also raised $500 million from investors while promising big returns. They used the money on private jets, fancy houses, expensive cars, and their plan for paying it all back was to attempt those crazy corporate takeovers that were supposed to make enough profit to cover everything. But then when the takeovers failed, they had nowhere to turn, no money to repay the investors, and it all fell apart. And so in 1993, Towers Financial would implode after being exposed as one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. But when it came time for his former business partner, Stephen Hoffenberg, to be deposed and tell his side of the story in court, he didn't just throw Epstein under the bus, he basically blamed the whole thing on him. But by the time the company collapsed and was being investigated, Epstein had already been gone for 3 years. He would never be charged with anything related to Towers Financial. Meanwhile, his business partner Hoffenberg, he would spend nearly 20 years in prison. I don't think we have an exact reason why Epstein was never charged for being on the inside of one of the biggest Ponzi schemes ever. One explanation is that Hoffenberg could have been lying. His testimony during his case was considered kind of generally unreliable. He would lie about a lot of stuff, wouldn't tell the truth. Another reason is that if Epstein was never really on the record as being deeply involved in the fraud, because apparently they didn't use his name for the trades or whatever it was, it's just hearsay. You know, we can't really prove that he's involved in the scam, so it's not worth pursuing if they did have Hoffenberg right in front of them and they could just punish him. However, another person would later write that it was only because of lazy prosecution that Epstein walked away, and that he was definitely involved as far as anyone can tell. Especially because it's well recorded that during the peak of the Towers Financial scam, Epstein was physically accompanying Hoffenberg around the world on his jet. He was meeting with investors. He was with him a lot of the time. And that's because somehow, after walking away from a moderately high-paying consultant job and apparently having nothing to do with the hundreds of millions of dirty money they made, he somehow pops up again a couple years later, completely reinvented, like his old self never existed at all. But the idea that Epstein's career is just kind of a story about failing upwards, like I mentioned earlier, that doesn't even really explain how he ends up where he did. Yeah, a teacher at a rich private school might get hired by one of his students' rich parents, okay? But 15 years later, walking away unscathed from one of the worst financial crimes in American history. I mean, seriously, most of us probably don't remember, but Towers Financial was absolutely horrible. Even back at that point in his life, a lot of his situations sound like a conspiracy. But of course, that's only one of these really odd stories that have been told about Epstein's careers over the years that imply all these different truths about how he ended up where he did. Multiple people over the years, journalists, friends, business partners, they all recalled Epstein suggesting or hinting that he worked for an intelligence agency, although he never specified which one. But in the mid to late 80s, during the same time he was working at Towers Financial, he also worked with Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi businessman with ties to the CIA and Mossad, who is best known for being the middleman in transferring American weapons from Israel to Iran during the Iran-Contra affair. Add on to that the fact that Epstein was later found to have a fake Austrian passport with multiple stamps from the Middle East, it only further paints a very confusing picture about Epstein's career. There just isn't a normal, sensible conclusion to this part of Epstein's life. Even after connecting all the dots, it still doesn't make sense. He starts off by dropping out of college without getting his degree, only to get hired at a prestigious school that he then gets fired from for being a bad teacher, only to then get hired at a hugely prestigious investment firm that he also then gets fired from, only to then end up getting implicated in one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history that he somehow never faces a single charge for being involved in. Along the way, he acquires fake passports, he does business with arms dealers in the Middle East, and at the end of all of it, he's filthy rich. At every single turn, you see him get not punished, but actually rewarded for stealing, cheating, and lying. But the craziest part of all of that is that that was just the beginning. In the late 80s, Epstein forms a new company, Epstein & Co., a wealth management firm where he establishes immediately that he's not going to take any clients with a net worth of under $1 billion. And his first client would indeed be a prolific billionaire, although the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Leslie Wexner would only create more questions than it answers. Les Wexner wasn't just rich, he was one of the most successful retailers in modern American history. After opening his own clothing store in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio in 1963, he grew his brand The Limited to 100 stores within 12 years. By the mid-1980s, he was purchasing other brands, one of which was the failing Victoria's Secret for $1 million. But within 10 years, by 1992, he grew it to a value of $1 billion. Over the years, he continued to buy and start more brands, Abercrombie & Fitch, Lane Bryant, Bath & Body Works, the White Barn Candle Company. Basically, if you've ever stepped into a mall in North America, you've seen Les Wexner's businesses. His brands still fill suburban shopping centers today. But Leslie Wexner was also a very strange person. In 1985, the year that he became a billionaire for the first time, he began building up his personal brand with interviews about his businesses, his life, but the man that the world was introduced to as the owner of Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie & Fitch, he seemed to sit somewhere in the gray area between spiritual warrior and mentally ill. On the morning Leslie Wexner became a billionaire, he woke up worried, but this was not unusual. He always wakes up worried because of his D-book, which pokes and prods and gives him the itchiness of the soul that he calls hins in Yiddish. Sometimes he runs away from it on the roads of Columbus, Ohio, or drives away from it in one of his Porsches, or flies from it in one of his planes. But then later it comes back, with his first coffee, his first meeting, nudging at him again. A D-book is essentially translated from Yiddish as a demon. As the article continues, it states that Wexner has been with the D-book since he was a boy, and that his father recognized it and referred to it as churning. He told New York Magazine that his D-book makes him wander from house to house, wanting more and more, and swallowing companies larger than his own. In other words, it compels him to accumulate more money and more power with no end in sight. Wexner also describes the D-book as an integral part of his genius. Throughout his career, he had a habit of cutting people off abruptly, even longtime friends and business partners. People would call him impossible to know. One person who interviewed him early in his life said that he acted as if he had met the devil. At one point, he bought every property near his mansion in Ohio so no one could be near him. He even built a massive estate modeled after an English manor, complete with secret passageways and interior surveillance, as well as walls outside. People would say that it didn't even seem like he enjoyed being wealthy. He just craved control of everything around him. He would micromanage every detail of the stores he owned, from the layouts to the fabric used in the clothes. And this is the man who would be the first big client of Epstein's private elite money management firm. Starting in the late 80s, Leslie Wexner handed Jeffrey Epstein practically complete control over his personal fortune. If you wanted to be funny, you could say that Epstein himself was Leslie Wexner's D-Book. But in reality, the dynamic that Epstein had with Wexner makes him almost look like a parasite. Virtually from the moment that Epstein arrived on the scene in Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner's brands were based, Mr. Wexner's friends and colleagues were mystified as to why a renowned businessman in the prime of his career would place such trust in an outsider with a thin resume and scant financial experience.
And it was around the time that Epstein launched Epstein & Co., his investment services company, that his life kind of just seems to completely change all over again for what feels like the 100th time in a row.
By the early 90s, he's moving like someone who's in charge of an empire. He's flying around the world in a giant jetliner, he's acquiring massive properties around the US, but at the same time, his name never shows up in Forbes. He has no public filings, no client list, no office, but to the people around him, it looks like he owns the world. By the late 90s, Epstein's doing what I could only describe as flying too close to the sun. He's friends with Donald Trump, the Prince of England, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He even buys a literal island where he would build an extravagant compound for hosting parties. But after a series of conspicuous stunts, one of which was a trip to Africa on his private plane with Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey as passengers, it gets to a point where Epstein is too big to ignore. The media, the general public, people are wondering how Epstein made all this money, where he came from, what's the point of everything he does. How he got to this level of social status is yet another strange story in this never-ending list of strange stories. And a big part of it would be this very, very strange story of his connection to the Maxwell family media empire. Robert Maxwell was born Ian Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hawk. He was a media tycoon businessman with a really strange life. After growing up Jewish in a small town in Romania, almost his entire family was tragically killed at Auschwitz. But he ends up joining the army in France after escaping, and he gets a bunch of medals for storming a Nazi machine gun tower and surviving. After the war, he changes his name to Robert Maxwell, moves to England, and gets elected into the British Parliament, but he also quickly starts building a media empire across Europe at the same time. Over a period of around 50 years, he ends up owning the Daily Mirror, he owns part of MTV in Europe, the London Daily News. At one point, he even buys the US-based Macmillan Publishers for over $2 billion in the late 80s, but throughout his life, he was also closely linked to Israeli intelligence. Robert Maxwell allegedly helped Israeli spies distribute bugged surveillance software to two of the most important nuclear research and security facilities in the US. At the same time, the United Kingdom would call him most likely a double or triple agent financed by Russia. He had known links to MI6, KGB, and Mossad all at the same time. Anyway, in the early 90s, Robert Maxwell is deeply in debt, his companies are struggling, and just a few days before he was scheduled to default on a $50 million loan, he apparently fell off the side of his yacht and drowned in the Canary Islands. Shortly after that, news comes out that he had been stealing hundreds of millions of dollars out of the pension funds from all the companies he owned to keep his lifestyle afloat, and his already tarnished legacy was ruined forever. But of course, that's not before he was given a lavish state funeral in Israel, attended by the prime minister and president and all current and former heads of Israeli intelligence. The point being, though, is that one of Robert Maxwell's 9 children, Ghislaine, had long been a prominent socialite in London and New York, and after her father died and the family empire collapses in the early 90s, she ends up living in Manhattan, where she would end up dating none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Notably, Ghislaine, the daughter of this internationally known billionaire spy for Israel, would become the primary link between Epstein and his powerful social network. Out of many things she would do for him, she would be the person who introduces him to Prince Andrew, Saudi royals, celebrities, politicians. Of course, Epstein was already pretty well connected, but his relationship with Maxwell was pivotal in him inserting himself into the upper echelon of society.
In March of 2003, Vanity Fair journalist Vicky Ward sets out to write a profile about Jeffrey Epstein and figure out what exactly he's all about once and for all.
Lately, Jeffrey Epstein's high-flying style has been drawing oohs and ahs. The bachelor financier lives in New York's largest private residence, claims to only take billionaires as clients, and flies celebrities like Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey on his Boeing 727. But Pierce's air of mystery, and the picture changes. And her point was that, after peeling back his mask of mystery, something far more alarming than anticipated would be revealed. Her research led her to question the idea that Epstein made all of his money with an exclusive and private investment firm where he'd only take on billionaires as clients. She suggests that Leslie Wexner is the only client Epstein ever had, but even more than that his business isn't really how he made his money at all. What she found made it look like Epstein really wasn't a genius investor at all, but probably acquired the majority of his mysterious fortune from the tower's financial Ponzi scheme, which he was far more involved in than the official story would suggest. She essentially made him look like a fraud, a con man with no substantial investing history, hiding behind the persona of an elite financial mastermind while building up a social network to make him look a lot more sophisticated than he really was. It's even worse than what they did publish about him is what they didn't. While she was working on her profile of Epstein for Vanity Fair, Vicky Ward was approached by two sisters who claimed that Epstein had sexually assaulted them in the mid-90s. One of them would have been under 18 at the time. They had even notified authorities, although no action was taken by the NYPD. Allegedly, Epstein had promised the younger sister that he could get her access to programs that would earn her admission to Ivy League schools she desperately wanted to get into. For the older sister, he offered financial support for her art career. Once he had them alone, they were both assaulted. Originally, their accusations were written into his profile in Vanity Fair, but while Vicky Ward and her team were working on the story, Epstein started showing up at their office and asking him not to include any mentions of the young women. Not only does Epstein show up at their office, but in that same week, a bullet and the head of a dead cat were placed on the front steps of Vanity Fair's editor-in-chief's home. After that, no mentions of these accusations were included in the final article. Vicky Ward would later write that she was so afraid of Epstein that she hired security to watch over her babies in the NICU when she gave birth prematurely a few months later. But I think ultimately these profile pieces of Epstein that painted him as this mysterious, maybe a little shady, maybe a little bit of a con artist, quirky, whatever, I think in a way it inadvertently helped him in the end. Even though they were casting shadows of doubt over his honesty and his business ethics, whatever, it wasn't in a way that raised serious concerns from the general public because they were leaving out the evidence, the accusations of serious sexual crimes they had heard while working on it. Into the mid-2000s, Epstein starts building up a new side of his persona, something he could really be known for, and that's being a patron of science. It gives dimension, right? Like he's a mysterious businessman who donates all of his money to science, and that kind of makes me poke less holes in who he is.
People sometimes wonder, like we're scientists, hanging out with him to get with these young women or something. There are some scientists like that. They were spending time with him because he was giving their laboratories money that they didn't have to write grants for.
Why was he doing that, though?
He clearly understood social engineering. He understood that rich people they can get anything they want, except the one thing they can't easily control is their reputation, because that requires other people's perceptions, and just being rich doesn't make you necessarily respected.
He donated tens of millions of dollars, some to MIT, some to Harvard. He would host dinners with guests like Stephen Hawking, Martin Nowak, Steven Pinker, some of the most famous intellectuals in the Western world. He would brand himself as a science philanthropist interested in genetics, AI, physics. His donations to Harvard would exceed $9 million. Maybe he was trying to build a big support network. Maybe he was buying friends who would defend his character in the future. Maybe his intentions were even more bizarre than that. At many of his gatherings, he would talk about a desire to inseminate large amounts of women at one time at his ranch in New Mexico, with the aim of breeding a better human race. But whatever his real intentions were, his intellectual friends loved him. Or at least some of them did. Other people he knew considered him strange, off-putting, bizarre. People would describe that Epstein's interest in science and art seems only centered around enhancing his persona, with no genuine interest in technical details at all. While famed mathematician Martin Nowak would call Epstein a genius, Steven Pinker would later tell a different story. I found it irritating to talk to him, all the more so because the reason he was in the conversation was because he had given money to these various projects. He likes smoozing with smart and intellectual people, but he couldn't really, or had very little interest in exploring actual issues. He would wisecrack, change subjects, or get bored after a few seconds. Daniel Dennett, philosopher and cognitive scientist, had a similar experience. He asked me manipulative questions as a conversational gambit. I remember he said, "Suppose I gave you $1 billion. What would you do with it?" He had no interest in my answer. It was just about showing off his wealth. The chemist Stuart Pivar attended multiple of Epstein's summits on his island in the Caribbean and had this to say. He couldn't concentrate on a subject for more than 2 minutes before having to change the subject, because he didn't know what anyone was talking about and would blurt out the dumbest things. In particular, he had an affinity for posing pseudo-deep questions like, what is up or what is down at the scientific summits he hosted on his island. Pivar recalled that the act eventually wore thin. After a couple of minutes, because he had no attention span whatsoever, he would interrupt the conversation and say things like, what has that got to do with pussy? And that was another big part of his persona. Epstein never married, but his romantic interests were still a focal point in his social life. Specifically, he liked young women. Lawrence Krauss, a longtime friend, would say that Epstein always has women ages 19 to 23 around him. Donald Trump would say in 2002 that Epstein likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. The people who interviewed him in the early 2000s would note that it was regular for him to have one or multiple young models in their early 20s near him at all times, even during his scientific summit gatherings. At one point, his friend Woody Allen wrote him a birthday note that would include a joke about Epstein being a vampire with a harem of young female vampires that work at his palace. For Epstein and his friends, his obsession with young women was an open joke. It was one that they went back to often on top of that. They weren't hiding it. It was one of their favorite go-to lines. But even when you take into account the fact that Epstein probably did get a lot of his money from a Ponzi scheme and he was doing dirty business, insider trading, like everything in the book, right? It's also kind of typical. There are a lot of people who have done stuff that's way worse than him and we don't really care. I think we all understand that billionaire capitalists become billionaire capitalists by exploiting, abusing, taking advantage of the financial system. We expect that. It's not really considered a sin in today's society, at least not in the way that we expect someone to be punished for it. And we also expect celebrities to be creeps. I mean, we have Leonardo DiCaprio. He throws his girlfriends in the trash when they turn 25. And people joke about that more than anything else. Like, we don't expect there to be some serious consequence. Years later, Vicky Ward, who had originally brought Epstein's lifestyle into the spotlight, would write, "If only it had all ended there. This was what it had been meant to be. A gossipy piece about a shadowy, kind of sinister, but essentially harmless man who preferred track pants to suits, but somehow lived very large and had wealthy, important friends, hung out with models, and shied away from the press. But it didn't." Because behind the curtain of money and mystery he built up, Epstein wasn't just another con man, and once the mask did slip, it would reveal horrors on a level that no one was ready for. The real story of Jeffrey Epstein was just getting started. In 1990, Epstein bought a house in Palm Beach worth a little bit more than $10 million. For Epstein and guys like him, it wasn't a place to live, it was a status symbol, like buying a BMW. If you wanted to be perceived as rich and powerful and well-connected, it was almost a requirement to have a place in Palm Beach. And for 15 years, it was his second home for parties, networking, visiting in the winter. But in 2005, his life in Palm Beach would also become the center of the unraveling of his life and reputation, or at least it should have been. In March of that year, an anonymous woman contacts the Palm Beach Police Department and claims that her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been paid to strip and massage Epstein. The story was that the girl, who attended a boarding school for troubled teens, had attracted unwanted attention from other students when she showed up to school with $300 in her purse. With other kids gossiping about her and making a scene, eventually the school police officer and therapist interviewed her to ask exactly what was going on. Visibly distressed, she described that an older friend had taken her to visit a massive waterfront mansion, where she was led by a 25-year-old blonde woman to a bedroom with a massage table where a man named Jeff demanded she undress and massage him. He also sexually assaulted her during their encounter. When she was shown a photo of Epstein as part of a lineup, she identified him immediately. The local police spent over a year building a case on him, completely undercover. They interviewed more than a dozen victims. They found hidden cameras in his house. They found a large number of photos of girls throughout his home, some of which were the girls they had been interviewing, but it just got worse and worse. Without being so graphic that YouTube limits the video, Jeffrey Epstein had a network of girls recruiting dozens of younger teenagers from all over the Palm Beach area to give him nude massages and sexually assaulting them while they were in the process. The police even found several girls' high school report cards in the trash at his home. It wasn't just this one thing. It was starting to look like his life in Florida was centered around abusing underage girls. It's evidence that he wasn't just finding victims in the Palm Beach area, but that there were girls being flown in from Brazil, Eastern Europe, and France as well, possibly thanks to help from Jean-Luc Brunel, owner of the modeling agency M2C, a company that Epstein had personally invested in. And so in July of 2006, after 13 months of investigating, Epstein was arrested by the Palm Beach police for procuring a minor for prostitution. Epstein ended up pleading guilty to both of the charges brought on him by the state of Florida, soliciting prostitution and soliciting a minor. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison. After 13 months in the Palm Beach County Jail, he registered as a sex offender and was released on good behavior, only attracting a little bit of mostly local press coverage. At the time, it wasn't really seen as a huge issue. A creepy rich guy in Palm Beach got caught, did his time, and the world moved on. Even stranger, though, is how it affected Epstein after he got out of prison, once he was back in New York to rebuild his old life, because it didn't. Epstein's social circle didn't reject or shun him for what he had done. Arguably, after jail, he was only more admired by his peers than he had been before. Almost immediately after returning home, he hosted a dinner that would be attended by journalist Katie Couric, filmmaker Woody Allen, comedian Chelsea Handler, and more. And then, a few weeks after that, he hosted a birthday party for Prince Andrew, fourth in line to the British throne. Some people even publicly defended him, including Lawrence Krauss, a theoretical physicist that Epstein had raised money for in the past. Though colleagues have criticized him over his relationship with Epstein, Krauss insists, "I don't feel tarnished in any way by my relationship with Jeffrey.
Jeffrey. I feel raised by it.
Another person would say,
I've never condoned paying for sex, but if a young lady lies about her age, it's her own fault.
Of course, though, it wasn't all positive. One person, the wife of Aeropostale CEO John Howard, would say,
all I see here is that if you have big money or are famous, you get a pass. Where I'm from, you'd be a social pariah. But the only thing that gets you shunned in New York society is poverty. A jail sentence doesn't matter anymore.
It wasn't like people didn't know what Epstein had done. It was in the news. They just didn't care.
Publicist Peggy Segal would say that I and many others that know Epstein describe him as brilliant. His unique mind is what attracts the world's smartest people to his home. Last September, with Segal's help, Epstein hosted a breakfast after Yom Kippur. A group of 120 friends brought their children over for a buffet dinner. One attendee, a New York real estate heir, has known Epstein for 35 years and visited him while he was in prison. He said, the side I've been reading about is a side I don't know. He said he considers Epstein one of the smartest people he knows and often asks him for investment advice. He would say, unless I've seen it, I don't focus on it.
Even his business continued on as it had before. Nothing changed. In 2015, he made a big investment in an Israeli startup founded by ex-Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who would also come stay in New York apartments owned by Epstein multiple times, while Epstein would visit Israel frequently as well. He even made a connection with Bill Gates, who supposedly was introduced to him while looking for donors for the Gates Foundation in 2014. Again, this is 5-6 years after he went to jail. Gates even flew on Epstein's plane to visit his house in Palm Beach multiple times. He's never really given a coherent explanation as to why.
I had dinners with him. I regret doing that. He had relationships with people he said, would give to global health, which is a interest I have. Those meetings were a mistake. They didn't result in what he purported, and I cut them off. That goes back a long time ago now. So there's nothing new on that.
He's not a pariah. He's not an outcast. I mean, his friend list is it's upgraded from what it used to be. And so throughout the 2010s, Epstein's case didn't really affect his life. He continued doing business, socializing, living the same as he always had. But if you fast forward almost 10 years, it's 2018, and the Miami Herald is going to run a series of articles titled Perversion of Justice. It's the result of a years-long investigation by journalist Julie Brown, and it throws literally everything about Epstein's past into question. One of the things is that Epstein had spent that last decade, despite the lack of public outcry, he had been paying millions in civil settlements to his laundry list of accusers. The controversy never really went away. He was just doling out massive amounts of money to make people shut up. And so Julie Brown introduces this new perspective that the scope of Epstein's crimes was so much wider than previously thought that he had not only gotten off kind of easy, but he had basically been actively protected by the legal system. Most of what she wrote had already been public information for a while, but this was comprehensive and deep. She documented more than 80 potential victims, all between the age of 13 and 18. She interviewed many of them, creating a cohesive narrative around the way that the legal system didn't just fail, but actively protected Epstein from facing justice. It turns out the story of Epstein's time in prison was a lot more complicated than just a year in the county jail. After Epstein was sentenced to just 18 months, he actually spent almost no time at all in his cell. He was allowed to leave the jail on work release for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, which is somehow possible despite being against the county's policy of sex offenders not getting those kind of privileges. Honestly, Epstein basically ran the jail he was housed at. When he wasn't at work, it was ordered by sheriffs that his cell be left unlocked and that he could have unlimited access to a TV room. Even more than that, he paid the county directly to set up a completely private housing area, separate from any other inmates, with deputies being assigned to accompany him while he was inside the jail and out at work. One deputy would later say that he was told his job was not to monitor or watch Epstein, but instead to provide security for him. Even the job he was commuting to, it was absolute bullshit. It wasn't for his financial management company, it wasn't for any of his pre-existing clients. In reality, Epstein had formed a nonprofit called the Florida Science Foundation immediately before he was sentenced, and he employed himself through it. There's no documentation on whether or not this nonprofit served any specific purpose at all, besides helping him get out of jail all day. They never filed any public records through the IRS or any other channels. Epstein would often travel to various meetings around the Palm Beach area with a private driver, and that the deputies supposedly assigned to watch him would often be told to wait outside of his meeting. After he was released for good behavior about 2/3 of the way through his original sentence, he had another year of house arrest and probation to serve before he was released from the supervision of Florida's jail system. But even that would end up looking ridiculous. While Epstein was on house arrest, he was allowed a list of privileges
privileges that were just so wide-ranging it feels ridiculous to claim he was even on house arrest at all. He was allowed to fly on his private jet from home to home, going to his island in the Caribbean, to Manhattan, to New Mexico, all on a regular basis. When he was at his home in Palm Beach, he was allowed to take walks around the beach. He even would go for shopping trips at the mall. At one point, a police officer detained Epstein on the side of the road when he realized he was out walking through Palm Beach in the middle of the day when he should be at home or at work, but his probation officer would say, Epstein has permission to get exercise. But even worse than that, it turns out that Epstein actually completely avoided the punishment he was supposed to receive in the first place. So while the Palm Beach detectives were investigating Epstein in 2008, they quickly started realizing that what they were looking at didn't feel like a local issue. It felt like something that was definitely crossing state lines, at the very least. And so they alerted the FBI, who also launched a 13-month-long investigation into Epstein's life, along the way identifying vastly more potential victims than the local cops were able to, totaling over 80 young girls that Epstein had made contact with. In the 53-page federal indictment that they compiled, he was facing charges like transporting minors across state lines for sex, sexual abuse of minors, child prostitution, witness tampering, all of which could have carried a sentence of decades in prison, if not life. And they suspected that he wasn't just doing this in Palm Beach, but was trafficking these girls to all of his homes, from Manhattan to New Mexico, from Florida to his private island in the Caribbean. It was even suspected that the girls would often be flown in from overseas with the help of powerful people he knew in the modeling industry. So what they found wasn't a rich creep. They had discovered a pedophile with crimes so wide-ranging that it was likely impossible he was acting alone. But somehow, Epstein was able to strike a deal with the US attorneys in Miami that would be so strange, so lenient, that it feels more like a favor to a friend than the resolution of a federal sex crime case. But how? How did he outmaneuver the feds? Because as we know, Epstein ends up in county jail for just a year, serving a laughably small sentence. People still argue today over how this was allowed to happen. The key figure, though, was Alex Acosta, South Florida's federally appointed attorney in the late 2000s. In his mid-30s, Acosta already held several presidentially appointed positions under George W. Bush, including being in the federal civil rights division fighting human trafficking. But he was ambitious and hungry to rise even higher. But when he was tasked with reviewing the FBI's investigation of Epstein, instead of taking the case to trial, Alex Acosta meets privately with Epstein's team of infamous lawyers and works out a non-prosecution agreement. Epstein wouldn't be charged federally as long as he would plead guilty at the state level. But the deal went a lot further than that. It ensured that no current or future co-conspirators could ever be charged, effectively shutting down the case if Epstein would take the hit, even if more accomplices were discovered. Even more disturbing, though, Acosta agreed, despite it being federally illegal, that the deal could be sealed and hidden from victims until after a judge approved it. He was essentially saying, yeah, sure, no one that Epstein has abused is allowed to know about this until after it's too late. But the worst part was that when the Miami Herald expose came out, Acosta had risen to become President Trump's Secretary of Labor, one of the closest cabinet positions to the president himself. With national attention suddenly focused on him, his explanation for the Epstein case was just strange. It was revealed that Trump's team knew about this before hiring him, but Acosta had initially claimed that he was told to leave Epstein alone because he might be an intelligence asset above Acosta's pay grade. But later, as public outrage grew, he backpedaled, claiming that it was just poor judgment, before resigning almost immediately. So how did Epstein simply walk all over a federal prosecutor? Part of it was Epstein's immense wealth. It allowed him to hire America's most powerful lawyers, Ken Starr, Roy Black, Alan Dershowitz, masters of manipulating the law. For someone like Acosta, who was highly concerned with his career trajectory, taking this case to trial might risk his reputation and future career if it didn't go the way he needed it to. Reports suggest that during the secret hotel meetings with Epstein's lawyers, they pressed Acosta hard with political implications and emotional manipulation. He was boxed in. They even threatened to write a book about the case if he didn't give them what they want. But beyond that, he just didn't handle it properly. Julie Brown's reporting says, among other things, Acosta allowed Epstein's lawyers unusual freedoms in dictating the terms of their own non-prosecution agreement. One lawyer would say, the damage that happened in this case is unconscionable. How in the world do you, a US attorney, engage in a negotiation with a criminal defendant, allowing the criminal to write up the agreement himself? Even the former Palm Beach police chief, who had supervised their investigation against Epstein, would speak out against how the FBI handled things. The cops thought they'd handed prosecutors the easiest case ever, a slam dunk.
the FBI spent many months painstakingly persuading some of the women that Epstein had abused to tell their stories. Prosecutors in Miami finally honed the narrative that they would present to a jury, a startling, sickening tale of an arrogant millionaire who they say systematically recruited and sexually molested barely pubescent girls, and dozens of them. This was not a he said, she said situation. This was 50-something she's and one he, and the she's all told the same story.
And so part of the outrage that explodes after this news comes to light is the injustice. And another big part of it comes from the fact that, coincidence or not, the key figure behind this controversy is now in the White House.
Secretary, were you ever made aware at any point in your handling of this case if Mr. Epstein was an intelligence asset of some sort?
So there has been reporting to that effect, and let me say, there's been reporting to a lot of effects in this case, not just now but over the years, and again, I would hesitate to take this reporting as fact.
At one point, Epstein's lawyers had even threatened to publish a book about the case if Acosta didn't let him off easy. I think ultimately, beyond being outright collusion between feds and Epstein, it kind of just looks like Epstein used his wealth to abuse the system. He hired aggressive lawyers, were able to convince everybody that the case should go away as quietly as possible, and he was lucky enough to come up against a prosecutor who was just using the job as a stepping stone and cared more about his career and his optics than right and wrong. But despite how corrupt the whole situation was, people also credited Acosta's negligence for being the exact reason why Epstein's case ever found the light of day again. Some journalists wrote that if Acosta had never been appointed to Trump's cabinet in the first place, the history of his misconduct in the case, and therefore Epstein's situation at all, probably wouldn't really be remembered. Even more, the Miami Herald article also brought new attention to dozens of lawsuits that Epstein had been served by his victims in the years following his prison sentence in the late 2000s. And with interest in the case rising, statements from the countless women he was abusing over the years would start to tell the story of just how disgusting and deep his operation was. One woman would say, "Something I think is very important to communicate is the loss of innocence, trust, and joy that is not recoverable. The abuse would devalue beyond measure my ability to form and maintain healthy relationships in my personal life. He could not ever begin to fathom what he took from us." Another victim would say, "Things happened that were so traumatic that to this day I'm unable to speak about them. I don't even have the vocabulary to describe it." One woman would talk about trying to jump off a cliff at Epstein's private island to escape his abuse. But that article was only the beginning. A couple months later, spurred by all of the renewed public interest in the case, federal prosecutors realized that Alex Acosta's deal with Epstein had been a huge violation of the 2004 Crime Victims Act all along. And so on July 6, 2019, Epstein is arrested at an airport in New Jersey by the FBI Crimes Against Children Task Force. That same day, upon entering his Manhattan townhouse with a search warrant, they discover thousands of sexually suggestive photos, some of which were found to be of underage girls. It was immediately clear that after already getting out of prison 10 years earlier, Epstein's activities had never stopped. Once he was in jail in Manhattan, Epstein would continue to try and have his way. After being denied a $100 million bond, he would engage in bizarre behavior like paying attorneys to sit in conference rooms with him for up to 12 hours, staring at the walls and purchasing every snack and drink out of the vending machines just to toss the majority of what he had bought in the trash. But it looked to everyone with eyes like the crimes Epstein had done were so bad, so horrifying, so wide-ranging that there's no way the people who he surrounded himself with wouldn't have known what he was doing. Basically, it was starting to look like Epstein might be the world's most well-connected pimp. The general public's reaction upon realizing that Epstein was basically allowed to get off scot-free after the FBI had a 60-page document about him, the realization that he was doing all of this while surrounded by the world's most powerful and wealthy people, it was kind of like an insane conspiracy come to life. Before Julie Brown's reporting on this, no one really thought of Epstein as anything more than a rich creep. But the federal deal allowing immunity for co-conspirators who are still unnamed, this was the moment where all of the puzzle pieces started really fitting together, and the narrow focus that people had of him being a bad guy suddenly paled in comparison to the realization that he was most likely only one of many, many bad guys. National media jumps on it, people are enraged, social media is on fire, it's overwhelming the news cycle. People just wanted to know how deep this went, because it was starting to look like the very foundation of our world might be rotten. There's so many things about him that people used to call complicated. It was just look horrifyingly simple. And I can't cover every accusation, victim, whistleblower, cover-up, theory, discovery, and story because that would take 10 hours. But we can look at his overall arc and see how this monster hiding behind the Epstein mask, he was never all that far below the surface to begin with. Obviously, we know that Epstein was kind of always a predator. As a high school teacher, he was creepy towards his girl students. Sure, but fast forward 15 years to his relationship with Leslie Wexner, the CEO of Victoria's Secret. He helps build his yachts, manage his investments, take care of his home. Epstein literally had power of attorney over Wexner's wealth. Throughout their relationship, though, reports start to show up that Epstein was being accused of posing multiple times, not as Wexner's money manager, but as a recruiter for Victoria's Secret. At one point, allegedly inviting a model to a hotel room in New York and assaulting her. At the same time, Wexner later found that Epstein had grossly misappropriated his funds during their business relationship, stealing over $50 million. Even his seemingly normal adult romantic relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell would turn out to be a monstrosity in disguise. For years, Epstein's basically never seen without her. Their mutual wealthy socialite couple persona was a big part of his life. She connects him to a lot of her famous friends. She helps him host parties. They mingle together. But she wasn't just his partner. She was also his recruiter and enabler. Publicly a sophisticated heiress, in private, she was finding, grooming, and delivering young girls to Epstein and his friends. She was just as evil and disgusting as Epstein himself, and the horrible crimes he committed wouldn't have even been possible without her involvement. When he bought an island near Puerto Rico in the late 90s, it became the center of his vibrant social life, a place for intellectuals, politicians, businessmen to come together for lavish parties and scientific summits. But at the same time, his island was attracting a negative reputation among locals, becoming known as Pedophile Island and Isle of Babes by those who lived near it. His plane, which would land frequently in the Virgin Islands carrying young-looking women for him to then take on a boat or helicopter to his house, it was nicknamed Lolita Express by the locals. An employee at the airstrip Epstein used, which was not on his island, would later say that
the fact that young girls were getting in and out of his helicopter and on his plane and on his boats, it kind of felt like he was flaunting it. But it was said that he always tipped really well, and so people who needed money overlooked it. My colleagues and I definitely talked about how we don't understand how this guy was still allowed to be around children. We didn't say anything because we figured that law enforcement were doing their job and that they were aware. I have to say that I regret it. But we didn't really even know who to tell or if anyone cared.
Friends like Bill Clinton, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Stephen Hawking, Prince Andrew, they all gathered there. And I think for a lot of people, the idea that the true nature of the island was going unnoticed, it's hard to imagine. Even the private island itself became a fixture of obsession for people interested in the Epstein case. It was found to be full of strange buildings, the strangest of all being a blue and white striped temple surrounded by patterns on the far southwest corner that serves no apparent purpose but provokes countless questions anyway. Rumors of rituals, a doomsday bunker, an underground lair. Like everything else in Epstein's world, it represents everything and nothing. But I think in the end, like in most cases with Epstein, the mystery was pretty much a cheap cover for what he was doing in plain sight. Emerging quotes from people Epstein knew painted him more as an intelligent yet total and utter fraud who built up the persona of a genius banker using funds he had stolen from a number of sources and then leveraged that money to buy the loyalty of very influential people, many of which still saw narcissism and sociopathy through the cracks in his mask regardless. And the fact that he was doing it right under the nose of America's most powerful people, wasn't even right under their noses. There's years and years of records of Epstein and his friends joking about his love for young women. It was funny for them. The Epstein case exploded all over American media in the month after he was arrested. Millions of people were waiting to see just how far down the rabbit hole might go. Old documents, interviews, victims, it was all resurfacing at lightning speed. But then, at 6:30 a.m. on August 10th, 2019, Epstein is found dead in his jail cell, just 5 weeks after being arrested. But before a cause of death could even be announced, the world decided that whatever it had been, he hadn't killed himself. The official explanation felt laughable. It had happened just after his guards fell asleep and at exactly the moment the cameras in his cell had broken. But over the last 6 years, the actual specific details around Epstein's death took a backseat to what he obviously did leave behind. A long, long list of lies and secrets. Epstein didn't kill himself became a shorthand for public distrust around the world. It was spray painted on walls in Europe, printed on t-shirts, tweeted by congressmen. It came to represent the idea that people like us were being lied to, and that people with money and power can get away with basically anything. Because even though Epstein paid the price of dying for his crimes, it seemed obvious that everyone else who had been around him had gotten away with it forever. Because in a way, when Epstein died, the case kind of died with him. Despite the public outcry, there wasn't really a clear path forward, at least at first. But then, just a couple months later, one of Epstein's most high-profile friends is suddenly forced into the spotlight. Prince Andrew, literally the Queen of England's son, who's been implicated in dozens of lawsuits and accusations against Epstein over the years, permanently resigns from all of his official royal duties, never to be seen in a public royal family capacity again. Another one of Epstein's close friends, prolific French model scout Jean-Luc Brunel, known for having his modeling agency directly financed by Epstein, having traveled on Epstein's plane over 30 times, he's arrested at the end of 2020 by French National Police and charged with rape of minors. Brunel was also found dead in his cell, allegedly having hanged himself before his trial even began. The Epstein case is a bottomless pit of horror. One of his most vocal accusers recently took her own life. Virginia Roberts, who was trafficked to Prince Andrew by Epstein and Maxwell as a teenager, after meeting Maxwell at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago spa, spent much of her adult life spreading the story of what Epstein had done to her. Just a couple months ago, she died at age 41 under what her family called suspicious circumstances. But while all of this is horrifying and strange, again, it eventually all takes a backseat to the bigger picture. Sure, some people got caught, but it looks like there were a lot more people who got away with it. Epstein was both a psychopathic pedophile and one of the most well-connected men on Earth. So who was helping him cover it up, and who was outright joining in? That's what America is still reeling from years later. Not what we do know, but what we don't. And that's for one very specific reason. In the years since Epstein's death, not one time has any federal authority given a coherent, non-conflicting explanation for anything about him. And somehow, every time people try, the situation only gets worse. The government hasn't handled it. The official narrative is full of contradictions. The files are still sealed. No one has ever been held accountable. The victim and suspect lists only get bigger and bigger. In the 6 years since Epstein's death, his case has only grown until it becomes a garbage fire on the front steps of the White House itself. 10 years ago, Donald Trump's presidential campaign was built on him being the anti-establishment, anti-corruption candidate. He's not a politician, so that's what's going to allow him to drain the swamp and expose all the rotten corruption in Washington. At least, that's what was supposed to happen. When Epstein gets arrested, Trump is in the middle of his first term, and the world turns to him to an answer for what's going on. But not just as the president, also as one of Epstein's most well-documented friends. Because Trump and Epstein had been good buddies for a long time. They had both invested in property in Palm Beach in the mid-'80s. They were both in the New York money scene, and there are countless photos of them together throughout the 90s, 2000s. It made sense. Back then, Trump was a real estate developer and a big media personality, and they were neighbors. In 2002, Trump would write that he had known Epstein for over 15 years, that he was a terrific guy, and that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and that many of them are on the younger side. Flight logs would reveal that Trump even traveled in Epstein's plane almost 10 times. The story goes that they eventually had a falling out over some sort of real estate deal and never really spoke much after that, but many years later, now having been elected the president of the United States right at the time when Epstein is back in the public eye, everyone's looking at Trump to have some kind of answer. And true to the anti-establishment persona that much of his first term was hinged on, and despite compliments and time spent together in the past, Trump says that he never liked Epstein, that he wants a full investigation into him. In fact, he would be demanding it. But the years go by and nothing really ever comes out besides reports on information that was already public. Epstein's girlfriend/handler/assistant, she gets arrested after a manhunt that ends with her being found in a cabin in New Hampshire. She gets sentenced to 20 years in prison, but still no proof of Epstein's clients or accomplices or anything really ever comes up. But still the public interest in Epstein doesn't go away. By last year, Trump's second campaign is underway and people are still asking him if he'll release more information. The conspiracy has been so powerful and just lacking a resolution that it doesn't stop. It's become this symbol of something bigger that people just need to know about. And this time with Trump running again, he promises again that he's going to do what he can to have all the files opened up. Months go by, Trump is elected as president again, and his supporters are just really asking for him to get serious and bring the truth about Epstein to light once and for all. And so just 1 month into the second Trump administration, US Attorney General Pam Bondi hints that the supposed Epstein files, including a list of his clients and accomplices, has just hit her desk and that they're just days away from releasing everything they know about him.
The DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients? Will that really happen? It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. I'm reviewing JFK files, MLK files. That's all in the process of being reviewed because that was done at the directive of the president from all of these agencies.
So have you seen anything?
But when the files are finally released, they're so heavily redacted and redundant, it was like they never put out any new information at all, which in itself makes people feel more suspicious than they did before. It was a disaster. Once again, political media is explosively angry about these repeated back and forths without any real accountability from anyone. This time though, instead of it just staying in the news cycle for a couple days to a week and becoming another classic example of the idea that nothing ever happens, the ghost of Epstein starts tearing the Republican movement apart from the inside out.
Why are you covering up the Epstein files?
Let's be very clear. I am for the release of those records.
A few months later, the Department of Justice, the FBI, they come out with this 2-page statement concluding that despite the fact they possess over 300 gigabytes of data and evidence around Jeffrey Epstein, that he in fact never had a client list at all, and that there are no further charges expected against anyone in connection to Epstein ever. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why Trump's extremely loyal base just doesn't really buy his response to the Epstein situation. He's getting ratioed on his own social media platform, his polling is down, influencers and commentators that have always stood by his side start to criticize the obvious lack of honesty.
It's a huge issue, and a poll just came out today that only 13% of those polled actually think the government is doing a good job in not covering up something here. 67% are upset with the way it's happening, including 60% of those are Republicans, 56% of MAGA is upset with that, and only 1 in 5 are not paying attention to this story, which means that 80% of the American public right now wants more answers.
Trump's response is almost a meltdown. He calls the renewed interest in Epstein a Democrat hoax, saying that it was made up by the liberals to make the Republicans look bad. He lashes out at his own supporters for even caring about Epstein at all. He says, "You're not really MAGA if you want to talk about this all day." He calls it boring, phony. He accuses the media of conspiring against him. It became a disaster for him quickly. Meanwhile, he's just kind of standing there diminishing the whole situation, saying that he doesn't get why people still care about Epstein.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. Are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable.
But then, in the middle of it all, the Wall Street Journal releases an alleged book of birthday messages from Epstein's 50th birthday in 2003. Some of the messages were from Epstein's longtime lawyer friends like Alan Dershowitz, one was from Leslie Wexner, one was from Bill Clinton, and one was from Donald Trump. Allegedly, he included a drawing of a naked woman and a note about their shared secrets. The Wall Street Journal, a notably conservative-aligned paper, is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who also owns Fox News. And that's only further proof that these concerns about Trump connection to Epstein are happening across all spectrums of political views. And since then, headlines have only gotten worse. Just a few days after that, the Journal also reports that the reason why the Trump administration has been so shaky on their Epstein stance is because Trump was told in May that his name specifically is present in the Epstein files. It even gets to a point where a congressional committee votes to subpoena the Trump administration for all records relating to Epstein in a vote that was passed 8-2, with almost all the panel's Republicans voting in favor. Basically, the public's belief in the Epstein conspiracy has become so strong that it surpasses even the Republican love for Trump, a previously impenetrable force of nature in American politics. I think there was a poll that showed that only 17% of people approved of how Trump was handling the situation, but even then, it still kind of looks like nothing is really going to happen. The fact that not even the testimony of a populist hero of a president could be considered reliable in relation to the Epstein case speaks to the betrayal of trust felt around the country. The Epstein story has reached the White House, the symbolic and literal image of American leadership, and it's turned it into a vision of corruption and darkness. It's no wonder why people are angry, and I think that anger is reaching across the entire political spectrum. There's so much evidence, so much that we don't know, that every day that passes without a resolution, it keeps making the people in power look more and more complicit to evil. But you just can't blame people for wanting to know who was involved in the Epstein story. The way that nothing has really ever come to light, but in fact it seems like the government itself is continuing to try and cover it up rather than put everything out in the open, it just makes the distrust get worse and worse. I think Epstein kind of represents the final stage of the breakdown of the social contract. Obviously, Epstein didn't invent corruption and abuse, but his story reveals it in a way that we've never seen before. It makes the justice system, the legal system, the idea of right and wrong, it makes it look like an idea that you almost have to be stupid to believe in. The justice system is supposed to protect people who get hurt. It's supposed to punish dangerous people. It's the thing that we're supposed to believe in as a tool for good, something that benefits and protects all of us. But it genuinely is difficult to trust that anymore, because clearly, if the people in power don't have to follow the same rules as the rest of us, the rules just don't exist. It's just a myth that was never real to begin with. Jeffrey Epstein lived without rules. He ruined countless girls' lives. They were silenced, paid off, threatened. Law enforcement at every level ignored him, while his victims suffered in silence for decades, with their abuser spending time with presidents and celebrities of all kinds. And then when it finally all comes to light that the president that everyone believed in, specifically because of the idea that he was for the people, has every excuse in the book except actually telling the truth, of course it's not going to go away quickly. And so for as long as the Epstein story remains unfinished, for as long as his friends and associates don't have to answer for themselves, it's going to keep being this open wound that represents a sickening truth about America, that the rich and powerful don't have to play by the same rules as everyone else, that abuse is okay, but only if you have enough money to threaten your victims and pay them to be quiet. And I don't think that's a world that most people want to live in. The idea of the ultra-wealthy, upper echelon secret society full of people who don't live by the same rules or morals as us, it's a popular idea. It always has been. We watch movies about it, we imagine what it would look like, but the reality that's revealed by Jeffrey Epstein is actually way more disturbing than people in masks in a gothic ballroom in New York. Because it's the people we elected to represent us. It's the people we see on TV. People who live their lives in the open. Not hiding in basements, but standing proudly in front of the entire world. In a world where our leaders no longer have to even pretend to respect the idea of right and wrong, it's a bad omen for the future. We're supposed to trust our leaders to maintain the systems of freedom and justice that we all want to believe in. But now, as time keeps passing, it looks more like a myth from the past than something that ever really existed. A system where the rules mean nothing, as long as you can pay your way out of it. I think we all already knew that was the case, but the idea that there's nothing off limits, not childhood innocence, not abuse of the federal justice system, the idea that right and wrong will lay down and die for someone with money, it disturbs people. It gets into our heads. And I think in a way, Epstein's story is about all of us. I think it shows us that a society built without accountability isn't really a society at all. It's just an illusion waiting to collapse. I'm Philip, this is Volksgeist. Thank you for watching this huge video. If you'd like to support the channel and buy one of these shirts that I designed and my team and I are manually embroidering ourselves in the US, the link to my brand is in the description. Our summer sale is still going on. The blanks are super high quality, the embroidery is really beautiful, and every purchase helps us a lot and helps us make more videos. So
thanks again for watching. You guys can go to spiritworld.store and support the channel by buying a shirt that is a really depressing reminder that our entire world is corrupt, but it also looks kind of good at the same time and is pretty high quality. Anyway, that's spiritworld.store to get the most morbid YouTuber merch that's ever been made with free shipping in the US. And thanks again, as always, for supporting what we do.